Final Fantasy XIV borrows a lot of inspiration from the real world to flesh out its own world. From simple naming conventions to architecture to religion and mythology, there are a plethora of things that can be analyzed. In particular, I will be covering the deities and their followers from Final Fantasy XIV, and how they relate to religions or myths in reality. In Final Fantasy XIV, there exist beings known as primals or icons, amongst other names. Most of these primals are able to physically manifest themselves from the prayers and offerings of their followers, and can be considered as gods. These prayers then influence how that primal will behave. Nearly every primal in the game shares a name or concept that exists as a deity or in legends of the real world. The first few of the player encounters are Ifrit, Titan, Garuda, Leviathan, and Ramuh. None of these deities are worshipped by the various races the player can be, and all but one of them are immediately hostile with the nearby city-states. As an additional note, these gods are not unique to Final Fantasy XIV and also appear throughout the Final Fantasy franchise, though called things other than primals. Ifrit, the Lord of the Inferno, is the god of the Beastman tribes of the Amalja, and the first the player will come across. The Amalja are nomadic lizard-like beastmen, most of which are warriors who will value strength above nearly all else. During his most recent summoning, the Amalja were actively fighting against the forces of the city-state of Ul'dah, and held a fanatical desire to crush them. This warlike behavior in turn is reflected in Ifrit, who is also lizard-like, is comprised of mostly fire, and is consumed by an unending wrath and hatred for all who do not follow him. In the real world, Ifrit or Afarit is a type of demon belonging to Islamic folklore. They are known as being one of the more powerful spirits in Islamic beliefs, and are generally considered to be cunning and malicious. They are described to be made of mostly of smoke and fire. Outside of the connection to both being comprised of fire, very little is shared between the game's Ifrit and reality, as Final Fantasy's Ifrit would rather just destroy his opponents instead of being cunning about it. As an additional note, as far as I can tell, there is no clear source behind the name of his followers, the Amalja. Titan, the Lord of Crags, is the god of the kobolds. The kobolds do not share much with other uses of the term in other media or mythology, its origin being of Germanic descent. As a side note, the term kobold have also been spelled as goblins, which has been used for another race in other media and in Final Fantasy XIV. In Final Fantasy XIV, they were referred to as subterranean, mole-like beastmen, and almost always have their heads encased in metal helms. They refer to their god as Great Father Titan, and Titan represents the will of the earth. To quote the Encyclopedia Eorzea, "Compassionate and gentle, Titan is as a father to his tunnel-dwelling worshippers, but woe betide those fool enough to provoke this colossus, for when his anger is waked, the very earth trembles and heaves under the unstoppable fury of his mountainous bulk." The obvious connection here relates to the Titans of Greek mythology, but there are many of them, and not just one. In general, it could refer to when the Titans were imprisoned in Tartarus, following the Titanomachy, when Zeus and the Olympians overthrew the previous gods, the Titans. Across different Greek stories, they have been called Earthborn, or those who dwell beneath the earth. Another connection, though somewhat more tenuous, would be the specific Titan Atlas, who is frequently shown to be carrying a globe, although his punishment is described as holding up the heavens. Garuda, the Lady of the Vortex, is the goddess of the Ixal. The Ixal are a group of flightless bird-like beastmen tribes, who are devolved descendants of a chimeric experimentation by ancient people known as the Allagan. Their god, Garuda, is known as an elegant yet fickle and bloodthirsty being. Even her followers fear her wrath, as she is known to lash out when her whims are not met. The real Garuda is a male demigod from Hindu mythology who serves as the mount of the god Vishnu, and as king of birds. He is shown as either a large bird or as a man with large wings on his back, and is portrayed as a protector capable of traveling anywhere extremely fast. This is quite the opposite of how the goddess Garuda is portrayed in Final Fantasy XIV, though in other installments of the Final Fantasy franchise, she aligns more with the protector archetype, notably Final Fantasy XI, which has a background much closer to the real world's myth. An odd choice by the developers, though, is that the Ixal naming scheme is very reminiscent of an Aztec-like naming scheme, which is very different from Hindi. Another odd note is that Garuda is a bit more overtly sexualized compared to some other female primals in the game, though it is more on the tamer side of things. Leviathan, the Lord of the Whirl, is the god of the Sahuagin. The Sahuagin are an aquatic beastman race that normally live beneath the oceans around the city-state of Limsa Lominsa, but have recently taken lands along the coast to serve as spawning grounds, causing conflict between the two. There is no mythology of which their name is specifically based on, but the Sahuagin from D&D is an obvious reference. Their god, Leviathan, is not seen so much as a being that they follow, but as a being to be feared and appeased through sacrifices, and is seen as a force of nature. This is fairly close to its name originating from the Hebrew Bible, where Leviathan is considered an embodiment of chaos, though the term is referenced in various ways throughout the different books. Most of the time, Leviathan is a massive fish or sea dragon that rules the oceans in conjunction with the behemoths over the land and the Ziz over the sky, both of which exist in Final Fantasy XIV in other ways. In some Hebrew legends, the Leviathan and the behemoth will battle at the end of time, with God intervening and slaying them both in the end. This theme of a powerful being slaying an embodiment of chaos, a motif called Chaos Kampf when dealing with mythology, is seen across most Indo-European cultures. The player character, later referred to as the Warrior of Light, is a good example of this motif. Some other examples of this from mythology could include Thor and Jormungandr from Norse myth, Susanoo and Yamata no Orochi from Japanese myth, and Indra and Vritra from Hindu myth, again with all of these names being used somewhere else in Final Fantasy XIV. Ramuh, the Lord of Levin, is the god of the Sylphs and a bit different from the other primals already talked about. He is the only primal listed so far to not immediately attack the player, though they do wish to test them in battle. The Sylphs too are one of the few races that have favorable impressions of the other races, as long as they respect the forests upon which they live. Ramuh is thought to be the creator of the Sylphs, and also takes to guarding the forest with extreme prejudice by striking down any who trespass with bolts of lightning. Additionally, his name does not come from existing mythology. However, in Final Fantasy VII, one of Ramuh's alternative names was Indra, which I just mentioned in the previous section. In Hindu mythology, Indra is the king of the Devas and Svarga, Hindu terms for deities and the home of said deities, and is associated with lightning, storms, and war. In the ancient Hindu text, the Rigveda, Indra is known as the deity who allowed humanity to prosper by defeating a great evil called Vritra, who is thought to have brought droughts to the ancient people living in the Indus River Valley. All of this is fairly close to how Ramuh is described throughout the game, though for the Sylphs and not the other mortal races. His in-game appearance, however, is much closer to how a wizard is usually portrayed, with his staff and great white beard being similar to other such characters like Merlin from Arthurian legend, or even more modern ones like Gandalf from Lord of the Rings or Dumbledore from Harry Potter. As I said near the beginning, there are too many primals and other powerful, sometimes more powerful, beings to go through in a decently lengthed video, but to quickly go through some other popular names: Odin, an Elder Primal, Bahamut, the Dreadworm, the Knights of the Round, Susanoo, the Lord of Revel, and the 12, patron gods of the various races the player can be. Some of these fit their name origins better than others, but overall I feel like the developers try to respect their source materials more often than not, and will often try to add various subtle nods to the characteristics of their namesakes. Though some of the other iterations of them in earlier games of the franchise may be a better take on their names, as such with Garuda.